Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. She vanished from her home, with no signs of a break-in, no packed bags, no goodbye, just silence. For 6 years, everyone asked the same question. Where was Tina Satchwell? But the real question was why her house never stopped keeping secrets. March 24th, 2017. Youghal County, Cork, a coastal town in southern Ireland best known for its quiet streets and slow tides. That morning, Richard Satchwell walked into the Garda station and told the officers that his wife, Tina, had left him. He didn't say she was in danger. He didn't ask them to check local hospitals. He said she had taken a break to clear her head. What Richard didn't explain, and what investigators would spend years chasing down, was why she left behind her phone, passport, credit cards, and the small dog she treated like a child. Or why, despite claiming to be concerned, he hadn't reported her missing for 4 days. And when officers arrived at the couple's terraced house on Grattan Street, there was no sign of forced entry. No suitcases were missing. Tina's keys were still on the hallway table. Her wallet was in the kitchen drawer. And in her bedroom, her glasses sat folded on the nightstand, the ones she needed for nearly everything. Gardaí conducted a basic welfare check, walked the perimeter, and left without filing a formal crime report. No search warrant was executed. There was no request for digital forensics. There was no immediate canvass of neighbors. And just like that, Tina Satchwell became a voluntary disappearance. According to Richard, Tina had talked about needing space. He said she was upset after a family argument and might have traveled to a nearby city. But when pressed for specifics, names, dates, destinations, his answers were inconsistent. Investigators made a note in the file. No confirmed sightings. Husband's account vague. At this stage, there was still no clear sign of foul play. But something about the house felt wrong. One Garda officer, later interviewed off record, said the place was too perfect. Clean surfaces, no photos in the living room, no clutter, no history, and that silence would echo for years. Tina's sisters, especially Teresa Dinjavan, refused to believe she'd left willingly. She never traveled alone, Teresa told a journalist. Not once, not to the store, not even to her doctor's appointments. And if she had wanted out, she would have told me. She wouldn't just vanish. It wasn't just the sudden disappearance. It was the precision of it. No digital footprint, no ATM withdrawals, no security camera footage, no suspicious vehicle in the area. As if she'd stepped off the earth in a place where no one was looking. In Youghal, the disappearance didn't initially trigger panic. Small towns like this have seen people leave before. But Tina's case started to stand out, not because of what was found, but because of what never was. No movement on her social insurance, no contact with friends, no body, no timeline, no crime scene. By April 2017, Gardaí expanded the missing person alert. They checked hospitals in Cork, bus terminals, ferry routes, nothing. Meanwhile, Richard did interviews with national media. He said he was devastated, that he was praying every day, but in each appearance he repeated the same phrases. She just needed a break. She'll come back when she's ready. His affect never changed. Behind closed doors, Gardaí noted his cooperation was surface level. He refused to hand over his devices voluntarily. He declined a polygraph. He stopped responding to phone calls from the liaison officer. Still, with no physical evidence of a crime, law enforcement had limited legal recourse. The case stalled. Then something odd happened. Richard tried to sell the house. That detail didn't make headlines in 2017, but it made its way into the cold case file, especially once officers realized there had never been a forensic sweep inside. No luminol, no cadaver dogs, no subfloor scanning. Forensic oversight like this doesn't just happen. It's often a matter of classification. In 2017, Tina was considered a missing adult. No warrant, no probable cause, no search, but 6 years later, when that house was re-entered, what they found would change everything. In the immediate aftermath of Tina Satchwell's disappearance, there was no formal suspect. But in any missing person case, investigators begin with the inner circle. And in this case, that circle was small, just one person. Richard Satchwell was Tina's husband of nearly 3 decades. Born in England in 1966, he had moved with Tina to Ireland in the late 2000s. Neighbors knew him as quiet, reserved, and punctual to a fault. He worked as a long-haul truck driver, rarely seen outside except during routine errands. While the media initially portrayed him as a man blindsided by his wife's sudden absence, internal Garda notes from April 2017 documented inconsistencies in his timeline and responses to basic questions. Tina had stopped working in 2015. Since then, she had spent most of her days inside the home. There were no children, no workplace colleagues, very few personal calls. She didn't use social media. Her only regular point of contact outside the marriage was her sister Teresa, who lived hours away. When interviewed, Teresa described Tina's behavior over the past year as changing, withdrawn, controlled. She wouldn't make plans without checking with him first, Teresa told officers in a voluntary statement. Even when it came to visiting family, sometimes she'd say she didn't feel up to it, but you could hear it. She wasn't deciding that on her own. Coercive control, by definition, is difficult to prove without direct testimony. It leaves no physical marks, but it can be tracked in routines, financial records, and shifts in behavior. In Tina's case, the couple shared one joint bank account, managed by Richard. Phone records obtained in April 2017 showed Tina made fewer than 10 outgoing calls in the previous month, none longer than 2 minutes. Her mobile data usage was almost non-existent. According to her sister, Tina had once said, "Everything I do is on his time. Even what I wear." Investigators began to reconstruct her final known week. Grocery receipts and store surveillance placed both Tina and Richard at a local Aldi on March 17, 2017. That was the last time anyone outside the household saw her alive. No CCTV captured her after that. No medical appointments, no cell tower pings beyond a 500-meter radius from the house. That silence, viewed through a behavioral lens, was no longer just absence. It was compression. Her world had been gradually shrinking, digitally, financially, socially, long before she physically vanished. One of the key indicators came from a local delivery worker who later told detectives that he noticed the same pattern for over a year. Richard would answer the door, even for packages addressed to Tina. She was rarely seen, he said. Not sick, just not there. While the case remained officially open as a missing person file, Gardaí quietly began requesting more detailed data: banking logs, IP address history, GPS metadata from Richard's phone. In May 2017, a search request was submitted for Tina's medical history. No activity since early March. Still, without a body, warrant-level access to devices or digital forensics remained limited. Richard declined consent for a full phone extraction. Officers recorded that he appeared cooperative on surface but resistant when asked about the days following March 20th. The final red flag came through civil channels. In July 2017, Richard attempted to alter their joint insurance policy. He stated Tina was no longer residing at this address. That document made its way back to detectives via the insurance company's fraud detection team. The change was never approved, but it was logged. There was no known conflict, no reported history of domestic violence. No neighbors ever called 911. No sounds of screaming, no blood, just nothing. Sometimes in missing persons cases, the absence of chaos is the loudest alarm. By October 2017, the Gardaí upgraded Tina's file to high-risk unresolved. But without any forensic trigger, no biological evidence, no confirmed crime scene, they still couldn't obtain a search warrant for the property. It remained a home, not a crime scene. And in that technical gap, the case went quiet. The house on Grattan Street never looked like a crime scene. No boarded windows, no police tape, no scent of bleach or ammonia seeping through the walls. To passers-by, it was just another mid-terrace structure on a narrow road in a quiet Irish town. But from March 2017 onward, it held a status that few knew. It was the last confirmed location of Tina Satchwell, and for 6 years it remained untouched. In standard missing person protocols, the place of last sighting is often the first to be forensically processed. But that never happened here. Because Tina's case wasn't classified as a criminal matter, the Gardaí had no legal grounds to execute a full forensic search. The house was walked through, visually cleared, and released. That oversight shaped the next half-decade of investigative stalling. The case file expanded, but it didn't move forward. Dozens of leads came in. False sightings in Dublin, a report of a woman matching Tina's description in a homeless shelter, another in France. None were confirmed. Gardaí pursued them one by one, traveling across counties, reviewing hours of grainy CCTV from public transit systems. But every path led away from the only place where the facts had been static, the home itself. There was no forensic data extracted from the interior walls, floors, or drains. No cadaver dogs were brought in, no ground-penetrating radar, no analysis of soil composition or latent traces of decomposition. In an internal review conducted in late 2018, a regional Garda superintendent flagged the case as chronically dependent on absence. No new data, no recovered belongings, no signs of life, yet also no physical sign of harm. One entry in the file read, "Not enough to prove something happened, not enough to prove it didn't." The structure of the house became the blind spot. Forensic teams would later confirm that it had multiple crawl spaces, irregular subflooring in the stairwell, and recent cement work in 2 areas, none of which were documented or tested in 2017. But at the time, no one had authorization to break through tile or pull back drywall, not without a warrant, not without probable cause. That absence of cause became the defense that protected the structure. Meanwhile, Richard Satchwell continued living inside it. Throughout 2018 and 2019, Gardaí performed background checks on his financial activity. There was no sudden increase in income, no large insurance payout, no unusual withdrawals. He was still working part-time as a truck driver. He wasn't living lavishly, but he also wasn't showing the behaviors typical of someone in grief. There were no private inquiries, no calls to missing persons organizations, no appeals for help after the initial interviews. And still, there was no trace of Tina. In 2020, a detective with the Missing Persons Bureau proposed a limited re-entry to the property, citing the length of time since Tina had been seen and the lack of confirmed travel or communication. The request stalled. The COVID-19 pandemic introduced complications for warrant execution and redirected resources across the force. The delay lasted years. By 2022, the house had remained virtually unchanged. Locals reported seeing Richard walking his dog, maintaining the front garden, and occasionally painting over the aging window frames. When asked by a reporter from the Irish Independent if he still believed Tina would return, he said, "I have to, otherwise what's the point?" That quote resurfaced later. Investigators didn't dispute its sincerity, but they noted the timing. It came shortly after Richard attempted to put the house on the market. That move triggered something. When property records were flagged for ownership transition, Gardaí used it as leverage to request a reclassification of the case. A new detective superintendent approved an escalation, not based on new evidence, but based on the lack of any. In towns like this, the superintendent wrote in a briefing memo, "A person doesn't disappear without leaving a trace. The absence of trace becomes the evidence itself." That memo changed the direction of the investigation. In early 2023, the case was officially upgraded to a suspected homicide, without a body, without a confession, and without physical evidence. The reason? Anomalies in the original clearance of the scene. That made the house eligible for a full search under new legislative powers granted for high-risk disappearances. A new forensic team was assigned, and for the first time in 6 years, they stepped inside with the tools they needed. In October 2023, 6 years and 7 months after Tina Satchwell was last seen, the house in Youghal was no longer considered a home. It was designated an active crime scene. The reclassification came after a change in investigative leadership and a reevaluation of case handling errors from 2017. A warrant was granted under high-risk missing person provisions. This time, the search would not be cursory. A forensic team entered the property at 10:16 a.m. on October 10, 2023. The operation was controlled, quiet, and without media presence. No neighbors were alerted. The perimeter was secured, and all entry logs documented by timestamp and officer ID. The search strategy was structured in zones, prioritizing areas that had not been previously documented in 2017. Zone 1, the main floor. Zone 2, the upstairs bedrooms. Zone 3, the stairwell, underfloor cavity, and foundation crawl space. It was Zone 3 that raised immediate concerns. Cadaver dogs signaled a positive reaction less than 3 minutes into the stairwell inspection. Officers paused and called in structural specialists. Thermal imaging detected a discrepancy beneath the midsection of the staircase. The subfloor concrete in that area was newer than adjacent surfaces. It had different thermal density and cured unevenly, signs consistent with non-professional repair work. No building permits had ever been filed for interior renovation. At 1442, authorization was given to breach the subfloor slab. A rotary hammer drill was used to remove the top layer of material. Underneath, a sealed plastic sheeting system consistent with vapor barrier insulation, but cut and refitted in a manner inconsistent with original construction. Beneath that, a shallow cavity, approximately 4 feet deep. Inside the cavity, investigators discovered heavy-duty refuse bags and multiple fabric layers, including a gray bedsheet with faded floral prints. The bags were intact but visibly decomposing along the lower seams. The area had a noticeable smell of organic decay, consistent with long-term concealment of biological remains. The scene was immediately sealed, and a forensics unit from the Garda Technical Bureau was dispatched from Dublin. The contents were extracted in segments. Preliminary visual inspection identified a partial human skeleton, wrapped in additional bedding and enclosed within the plastic bags. No attempt had been made to dismember or destroy the body. It had been hidden, not altered. DNA confirmation was returned on October 13, 2023. The remains were positively identified as Tina Satchwell. What happened next was procedural and necessary. The property was no longer a suspected scene. It was the confirmed location of a long-term concealment of a deceased person. Richard Satchwell was arrested within 36 hours of the discovery. He was located at a secondary property in Cork and taken into custody without incident. The official Garda press release stated, "The body of Tina Satchwell has been recovered. A man in his 50s has been arrested on suspicion of murder. No further comment at this time." Behind the scenes, the forensic team compiled their findings with care. The cavity was measured and documented. Soil samples were preserved. Textile fibers from the bedsheet were analyzed for trace elements. No accelerants, no chemical treatment, no masking agents were detected. The concealment had been achieved not through sophistication, but time and silence. One forensic pathologist later noted, "The integrity of the scene was remarkable, only because no one disturbed it. It was containment by neglect." Autopsy results were limited due to decomposition, but fractures were noted in the cranial region and hyoid bone, both injuries consistent with mechanical trauma to the head and neck. There was no evidence of natural death, no medication traces, no chronic illness markers. This was a concealed homicide, and it had been concealed in plain sight. For investigators, the most difficult realization wasn't how Tina had died. It was how long her death had been waiting to be discovered. 6 years. In a place law enforcement had walked through and signed off. There's a reason cold cases stay cold. Not because no one looks, but because they often start with assumptions. She left. She needed space. She'd come back. But no one thought to ask if the house itself was keeping her from doing so. The recovery of Tina Satchwell's body under her own staircase shattered any remaining pretense of ambiguity. It wasn't just a disappearance anymore, it was a homicide. And now there were questions only one person could answer. Richard Satchwell was taken into custody on October 12, 2023. The arrest was methodical. No resistance, no scene. He was brought to the Garda station in Cove for formal questioning. His demeanor was noted as calm, detached but cooperative. That description would repeat itself across multiple interviews. In his initial statement, Richard didn't deny the body was Tina's. He didn't contest the DNA results. Instead, he offered a version of events that investigators had heard before, but with a new twist. He claimed Tina had died accidentally. He said she had fallen down the stairs during an argument, that she struck her head, that he panicked, that he didn't know what to do. So he wrapped her body in bedding and placed it beneath the floor, pouring concrete over it days later to keep her close and avoid embarrassment. That version didn't match the forensic record. The hyoid bone in Tina's neck was fractured, an injury far more consistent with manual strangulation than a fall. Fractures in her skull were blunt force, not typical of stair trauma. The position of the remains and wrapping method suggested deliberate concealment, not a moment of panic. But beyond the physical injuries, it was the timeline that started to unravel his story. Digital forensics filled in the blanks that words couldn't. Investigators obtained a full data extraction from Richard's mobile device, now permitted under the homicide warrant. They reconstructed location history, call logs, and browser records for the days surrounding Tina's disappearance. On March 20th, 2017, less than 48 hours after Tina was last seen alive, Richard conducted multiple online searches for fast-setting concrete, weight of cement per bag, and how to seal under stairs. Those search terms were time-stamped, geotagged, and aligned with the time he later told officers he was waiting for Tina to return. Receipts from a local hardware store showed a purchase of 5 bags of dry concrete mix and 1 large tub of water sealant. CCTV from the same store confirmed Richard at the register. He had said Tina left the house with a small suitcase, but the CCTV from their neighborhood showed no such departure. No figure resembling Tina ever exited the home. No cab pulled up. No vehicle registered to her was ever seen leaving the property. The last time any digital trace of Tina appeared, whether by text, call, or location, was March 20th at 9:48 a.m. That signal ended inside the house. After that, it was only Richard. He continued to use the joint account, continued to live in the house. He granted no one access to the stairwell area, even during maintenance visits. A plumber recalled being denied entry to the lower landing during a routine service in 2020. The narrative of panic no longer held. What emerged instead was a pattern of calculated post-crime behavior. Not impulsive, not chaotic, just cold, delayed planning. In the interview room, when confronted with the data sequence, Richard didn't argue. He didn't recant either. He simply stopped responding. Interview transcripts show multiple silences exceeding 30 seconds. Sometimes, what a suspect says matters less than what they can't explain. Behind the scenes, officers admitted to a shared frustration. Not because the evidence wasn't strong, but because it had taken 6 years to even look in the right place. Tina had been buried under the floor the entire time while investigators followed false leads across 3 countries. Her disappearance wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't masterfully covered. It simply relied on hesitation, legal barriers, and the assumption that no real crime had occurred. And that assumption cost 6 years of silence. By the time the trial date was set for May 2025, the case against Richard Satchwell had already taken form, not through confession, but through corroboration. It wasn't built on a dramatic moment of truth. It was built on accumulation, patterns, timestamps, omissions, contradictions. The prosecution's strategy was clear: establish control, show intent, undermine the narrative of accident, not with speculation, but with evidence that didn't need interpretation. In pre-trial motions, prosecutors laid out their core theory. Tina Satchwell had been isolated, her movements restricted, her financial and digital independence minimized. The household structure wasn't just physical, it was behavioral. The prosecution team presented Tina's gradual disappearance from public life not as consequence, but as condition. That context became admissible. Data analysts mapped Tina's decline in personal communications, from over a dozen outgoing calls per week in 2015 to just 2 in the entire month before she vanished. Bank activity showed that in the last year of her life, Tina hadn't used a debit card even once. Surveillance from local shops revealed that nearly every purchase, even routine groceries, had been made solely by Richard. This wasn't just about what happened on the day she died. It was about what had been happening for years. In court, jurors were shown digital logs reconstructed from Richard's device. Searches for concrete mix and underfloor ceiling materials, time-stamped before Tina was ever declared missing, aligned precisely with hardware store receipts. Investigators outlined the tools purchased, their specific use in the concealment, and the absence of any unrelated construction in the home. Forensic technicians testified that the burial site showed signs of manual excavation. It wasn't rushed. The layering of bedding, plastic, and poured concrete suggested deliberate action, not panic. The defense offered no alternate suspect. Instead, they leaned heavily on emotion. Richard's attorneys characterized him as an overwhelmed man facing an unforeseeable loss. They argued that fear, not malice, had driven his choices, that the concealment of Tina's body was a catastrophic lapse in judgment by a man with no prior criminal record. But forensic logic left little room for doubt. The pathology report confirmed perimortem trauma to the skull and neck, consistent with force and inconsistent with a simple fall. Tina had not died where she was found. The injuries suggested an upstairs location, followed by transport to the cavity beneath the stairwell. The prosecution then introduced one final detail, a photograph from the original 2017 search. In that image, the stairwell appeared freshly painted, not mentioned in any of Richard's statements. not listed on any service invoice. The covering wasn't forensic, it was cosmetic. That moment mattered, not because it proved guilt outright, but because it reinforced the theme the prosecution relied on. Concealment was not one act. It was sustained layer by layer, choice by choice. The trial lasted less than 3 weeks. During closing arguments, prosecutors refrained from dramatics. They didn't call Tina an angel. They didn't label Richard a monster. They asked jurors to follow sequence over sentiment. Because in criminal cases, the absence of logic is what often reveals intent. On the morning of June 4, 2025, the courtroom at Dublin's Central Criminal Court was already full before 9 o'clock a.m. Members of the press, legal observers, and members of Tina Satchwell's extended family filled the public gallery. After nearly 3 weeks of testimony, cross-examination, and evidentiary sequencing, the jury returned to deliver their unanimous verdict: guilty of murder. The sentence was issued moments later: life imprisonment. No parole recommendation, no mitigating remarks. Richard Satchwell showed no visible reaction. He stood quietly, his hands behind his back, while the judge outlined the severity of the offense, not just in act, but in duration. The concealment, the misdirection, and the years-long manipulation of perception were emphasized not as side notes, but as evidence of sustained intent. Tina's family remained composed, no display, just stillness, a sense of resolution, delayed but intact. Outside, the Garda released a one-paragraph statement confirming the outcome. The press coverage that followed was focused, fact-based. There were no speculative headlines, no dramatized accounts. The data, the forensics, the timeline, they told the entire story. But the conviction marked more than legal closure. It forced a broader reckoning. Within 72 hours, Ireland's Minister for Justice called for a full procedural review of how long-term missing persons cases are managed by law enforcement. The core question wasn't about guilt, it was about access. Why did it take 6 years to search a house where the victim was last seen? Why weren't cadaver dogs deployed earlier? Why was a domestic relationship allowed to shield a crime scene? Forensic experts testified during trial that the burial cavity beneath the stairs had never been included in initial property diagrams submitted by Gardaí in 2017. There had been no mention of concrete alterations, no recorded anomalies. It was missed not because it was well hidden, but because no one looked hard enough. That institutional gap became part of the public discourse. Several former investigators spoke anonymously in post-trial interviews. One admitted, "We treated it like she left, and we stayed in that frame too long." Another said, "The minute someone says it's not a crime, you stop thinking like it is." The fallout went beyond procedure. In Youghal, a community known for its coastal quiet and close-knit neighborhoods, residents expressed unease, not because someone had committed a crime, but because that crime had lived among them undetected. A man walked his dog, went to shops, painted his front door, and kept up appearances, while his wife's body was entombed a few feet below. More than one neighbor admitted they had assumed the best. And that's what makes cases like Tina's difficult. They don't begin with panic. They begin with trust, with familiarity, with the benefit of the doubt. The emotional weight fell heaviest on those closest to her. Teresa Dinjavan, Tina's sister, addressed the media briefly outside the courthouse. "She was never missing. She was always right there, and that's what hurts most, that we waited while she was never gone." No restitution could make up for 6 years of uncertainty. No sentence, no legal outcome can replace time lost to unanswered questions. But the conviction gave her family and the public a definitive truth, backed by data, timelines, and physical evidence. This wasn't a case solved by confession. It wasn't cracked by an informant. It was solved when someone finally asked the right question: what if she never left? And once that question was asked, everything unraveled. Justice, when it finally came, was clean on paper. A guilty verdict, a life sentence, the forensic record sealed, the remains buried respectfully. The media cycle moved on. But inside the quiet aftermath of the Tina Satchwell case, something far more difficult remained. What hadn't been said, what hadn't been done, and what hadn't been asked soon enough. From the outside, this case was closed. A man was convicted. A timeline reconstructed. A missing woman found. But closure, in real terms, doesn't arrive at sentencing. It arrives, or fails to, when systems recognize their own blind spots. And in Tina's case, the blind spots weren't in the evidence. They were in the assumptions made around her. The review launched in June 2025 by Ireland's Minister for Justice wasn't symbolic. It was a formal acknowledgement that procedural decisions in 2017, particularly the failure to classify Tina's disappearance as high risk, had directly contributed to the delay in discovering her remains. Internal documentation revealed that Gardaí lacked standardized escalation criteria for adult disappearances in domestic contexts. If there were no prior police reports of violence, no signs of a struggle, and no children involved, cases were often left in a holding pattern. Tina disappeared into that pattern. Her case became an example of institutional inertia, where action wasn't denied, just delayed indefinitely. The review proposed policy changes, redefining the threshold for forensic access to private residences, mandating the use of cadaver dogs within the first 72 hours of unexplained adult disappearances, and enhancing data flagging for behavioral control patterns that don't leave physical bruises. The proposed changes were necessary, but they also came too late for Tina. During trial, much was made of what was discovered: the remains, the search logs, the receipts, the data. But what defined the crime wasn't what was found. It was how long it took for anyone to look. And that delay wasn't malicious, it was systemic. In domestic cases where no prior violence is on record, law enforcement often leans toward voluntary absence. If no one sees a crime, and no one hears one, the assumption leans toward peace, not silence. That's what happened here. But coercive control doesn't require bruises. It doesn't trigger alarms. It unfolds slowly, over years, through isolation, dependency, and silence. Tina Satchwell's world shrank before she vanished. By the time she did, no one noticed because there was so little left to miss, digitally, socially, financially. That pattern must now be part of the investigative framework, not an afterthought. The public learned a hard truth during this case. Not all missing people are missing by their own will. And not all killers use weapons. Some use time, some use the benefit of the doubt. For Tina's family, justice came late, but it came. Her sister, Teresa Dinjavan, declined multiple interview requests after sentencing. Her only public comment was brief: she mattered. Every day she was missing, she still mattered. That's what this case returns to: presence. Tina wasn't invisible. She was overlooked. Her routine had become so controlled, her visibility so diminished, that her disappearance read as plausible, and that reading, reinforced by law enforcement decisions in the early days, gave her killer time. Time to clean, to lie, to cement her beneath the staircase. One of the most chilling truths about the case is that no high-level concealment effort was ever made. The body was placed under a stairwell. No remote woods, no fire, no body dump, just domestic infrastructure. It worked for 6 years, not because it was clever, but because it relied on others not questioning the simplest version of events. That's what this story leaves behind. A legal system that now has cause to reform how missing persons are categorized. A reminder that families who insist something is wrong, even without visible evidence, deserve to be taken seriously. And a lesson in how familiarity can prevent scrutiny, especially in close-knit communities where character is assumed and doors are rarely locked. When we tell true crime stories, it's easy to focus on the moment of violence, the weapon, the arrest, the courtroom. But real justice work often lies in what comes after. The systems changed, the lives reevaluated, the silences disrupted. Tina Satchwell didn't have a dramatic final moment in the public eye. She had years of quiet dismissal. And in the end, what cracked the case wasn't a sudden confession or a stunning clue. It was persistence. Her families, her sisters, and eventually a new generation of investigators willing to re-examine what had been overlooked. Some stories end with closure. This one ends with a challenge: to listen earlier, to search deeper, and to question silence before it settles into stone. What we choose not to see can be just as dangerous as what's hidden. Tina's story reminds us that silence in a relationship isn't peace. It can be erasure. If you've ever ignored your instincts because others said everything looks fine, this case is a wake-up call. As someone who spent years studying stories like these, I urge you, listen harder, speak sooner, and never underestimate quiet control. If this story moved you or made you think differently about safety, justice, or how we care for each other, Leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from or share your thoughts. If you didn't like the video, I'd still love to hear why. Your feedback helps us grow. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story. We've got more coming, stories that matter.